Len and Ablak Gemara. We are up to Daf Ches Amud Aleph. We're actually towards the bottom of the page. We went through the different Shavah brachas. By the way, you look at the Gemara, that's 6 brachas. The 7th bracha is Boire Pri Hagafen. And there's actually a machlekes. When do you make Boire Pri Hagafen? You know, the way we do today, by under the chuppah, we make Boire Pri Hagafen first. But by the Shavah bracha, the table, we make Boire Pri Hagafen last. There's a big argument. First of all, why that should be that change. There's a big argument by Shavah bracha, the table. Do you make Boire Pri Hagafen last or first? And because others argue that it's a hefsik, and by Boire Pri Hagafen should be as close as possible to benching itself. And others say that no, the Shavah brachas after the benching are all part of the whole benching thing, and therefore you can make Boire Pri Hagafen at the end. They want to say there's a difference between the Shavah brachas under the chuppah and the Shavah brachas by when the meals you have the 7 days after the wedding, and that is that we know that a kala, we learned yesterday, a kala, we mentioned Rashi says kala beloy bracha is kilu boil nida. That if you marry someone without doing Shavah brachas, it's as if you were living with a nida. That's all you need is one. You don't need 7 days of that, which means as follows. They want to say that the Shavah brachas under the chuppah is a birchas hamitzvahs. It's a mitzvah. You make a bracha on the mitzvah of getting married, and therefore it's so essential. The Shavah brachas, the other 7 days, is purely birchas hashavach. These are praises to Hashem. It's a different category altogether. And since benching is you're praising Hashem and so on, and this is a continuation of that, and therefore they argue you can make Boire Pri Hagafen at the end, at the end. Anyway, it's an interesting discussion. We are up to towards the bottom of the page, about 4 lines from the bottom of the page. Rabbi Chaviva, Ikloi, or 5 lines at the bottom of the page. Chaviva Ikloi lebei mahola. He once came to a house where there's a bris milah, and Barich, and he made a bracha by benching shehas simcha b'maynei. It's not exclusive to the domain of a chassan kala. You could also do it by a bris milah. So the Gemara said, is not like it. Why not? The parents are so distracted. The East Late Sidle Yenuka, they're not very happy. There's tsar to Yenuka. We had this Gemara need as well. You can't be. How can we be happy and everything else while the child is in pain? And because the child is in pain and the parents feel it, we cannot say Shasimcha b'moinoi. As a result of that, there's a machlekes by opinion haben, whether you should say Simcha b'moinoi, because over there nobody's in pain. Maybe you should say Shasimcha b'moinoi. Others argue no. By a bris, a chasna is a mitzvah of simcha. By a bris is also a mitzvah. The pasuk says, "Sos anochi al imrasecha." We had it in the 19th period of Shabbos. Sos anochi al imrasecha. I'm so happy when you told me these things, which is talking about bris milah. So therefore, a bris milah, we have the word sos, which is sos and simcha. So it makes sense to say shehas simcha b'moinoi. Nowhere does the Torah associate simcha with pinyan haben. So therefore, you don't make simcha b'moinoi pinyan haben. You don't make it by bar mitzvah or bas mitzvah or anything like that, because there's no accent anywhere on the simcha part. The chasanim are part of the minyan. The ein avelim min haminyan. The avelim are not part of the minyan. Yep. So the chasanim can be counted as the minyan of Shavah brachas, 9 plus the chasan. But when it comes to avelim, the bracha that are meant to be said, as we'll soon see, the oval is not part of that 10. There's 10 plus the oval. And there's an interesting. So by chasanim, because of simcha, the chas is also included in simcha. There's an interesting debate. There's a mitzvah there's a din that says you're not allowed to go to a wedding. If we had more brachas in the beginning, you're not allowed to go to a wedding unless you're misameach with chasan bekala. If you go and you're not misameach with chasan bekala, you're over on 5 kailas. You committed transgression. There's a big debate whether the chasan has a mitzvah to be misameach himself. Because is he, or by the chassid, it's automatic as simcha. There's no mitzvah to do something when it's natural. It's everyone else who doesn't come so naturally, we turn it into a mitzvah. But either way, the simcha they're involved, so therefore the chassid can be part of it. But the avelim, their inyan is to say a bracha about whatever they're saying there, as we'll see more later, the others not involved. Maybe that's a question. It says in the Brayso chasanim, the avelim, and it's clear that avelim are part of the minyan. The Gemara said, "Masnite korom to Rav." You're asking a question about Brayso and Rav. Rav Tanahu Polig. Whenever the Gemara is pushed against the wall, pressed against the wall, they have no alternative. They'll say, "Listen, Rav was a Tana, and he has every right to argue. He has every right to argue." Itma, we learned Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Chasanim min haminyan. that Chasanim are for the minyan, the ain't Avelim in a minyan. So Rabbi Yechon says exactly the same thing as Rab, that Chasanim are part of the minyan, but Avelim are not part of the minyan. Well, that's the same question. Chasanim and Avelim are for the minyan. That means it's clear about Avelim are. So we answer Kitanya, that brisa where it says that Avelim are part of the minyan is talking about Birchas HaMazon. We're talking about benching. And Kikam, but Rabbi Yechon says that they're not part of the minyan, it's talking about Beshura. So if it's by benching, the Chasan is part of the minyan. The way Rashi learns benching means being part of the Mezumah. Then the Chasanim, then Avelim can be included in that number to teach you that Avelim are Chayv and Mitzvahs, except Tefillin we mentioned yesterday. However, on the first day. However, the brisa that says that Avelim are not part of the minyan is talking about Beshura. Shura is after you finish the Levaya. In those days, they used to have the Oval sitting down in the middle, everybody surrounding him and saying, today we have the other way around. Everybody stands in two lines, and the Oval, the Avelim, and Avelos walk right in between them. Now, Taisus is a fascinating Taisus. I'll just taste of Chesam and Aleph. Rav Tana who Polik. So remember learning inside the interesting Taisus. So we have Rav who says Avelim not part of the minyan. We have Rabbi Yechon says Avelim not part of the minyan. We ask Rav a question, contradiction to Brises, and we say, what are you asking a question of Rav for? What is Rav? Rav is a Tana, he can argue. Now Rav was a student of Rabbi Yaina HaKadosh. So Rav lived in the last generation of Tanoim, and we count him as a Tana, as an Amay. He straddles both generations. Now Rabbi Yechon was also Talmud of Rebbe. True, they say he was a younger Talmud, but he was a Talmud of Rebbe. In fact, there's one version where it says Rabbi Yechon was Rav's Rebbe. But apart from that, generally Rabbi Yechon was much younger, and he was there. And we had a Gemara where Rabbi Yechon describes how special Rav was, and when he sat by Rebbe and the fire was all around him and everything else. So Taisha says here, Rav Tana Polik. Taisha wants to know why we don't answer the same thing Rabbi Yechon. He's a Tana, and he can argue. So he says, he doesn't want to answer Kitanyahi bebichas. Sorry, we'll skip a few lines. But 5 lines in places, the second word. He doesn't say here, Rabbi Yechon Tana Polik. Rabbi Yechon is also a Tana, and he can argue. Says Taisus of Chesam and Aleph in the last Taisus on the page. Yesh lechi, we can prove from here, Rabbi Yechon Amayra Hayu. Rabbi Yechon was 100% an Amayra, and he did not have at all that stamp that he was also a Tana. Because the Ihavi Tana, because if he would have said so, having Mashani, Kid Mashani Rav, then we could have answered the same question on Rabbi Yechon. We answered on Rav, because it's not a great answer we're answering. So therefore, we should have answered, he's a Tana, leave him alone. So therefore, we know Rabbi Yechon was, even though he studied by Rebbe, he was not a Tana, and Rav was. Then Taisus asked the question, don't ask me, why doesn't Rabbi Yechon say, I hold like Rav, and Rav was a Tana, and therefore, what do you ask me a question from a Brisa? Okay, I'm not the Tana, but Rav was. The Tana who, so he says, Rabbi Yechon, Rabbi Yechon was a colleague of Rav. So when he saw his colleague, he never saw him how others see him. Others saw Rav as a Tana. Rabbi Yechon saw Rav as an Amayra. Therefore, he didn't want to say, I'm leaning on Rav. The Polygalab, they continuously argue. If he thought he was a Tana, how would he argue with him? So Rabbi Yechon, conclusively from this Gemara here, we see was an Amayra. Rav was both, and therefore, whenever we're stuck, we say Rav was a Tana. But Rabbi Yechon did not treat Rav like a Tana. So Taisus says. So then the question is, so how come we had the Gemara whenever there's an argument Rabbi Yechon and Rav, the halacha is always like Rabbi Yechon, not like Rav. Rav is a Tana, Rabbi Yechon a Meira. So it must be Rabbi Yechon was greater, as the Rishonim said. Rabbi Yechon was greater than Rav. Now there's a Rashi in Gittin where Rashi said that Rav was a mediocre student, was in the middle, not on top, even though there was a fire burning around, like Rabbi Yechon himself described. As far as learning, that was Kedusha. But as far as learning was concerned, Rashi says in Gittin, in the late noons, that Rav was a mediocre student. So maybe Rashi gets it from this thing here, that why is it the halacha is like Rabbi Yechanan whenever he argues Rav, if Rav was a greater student, must be that Rav compared to Rabbi Yechanan was considered mediocre. That's how Rashi would learn. Anyway, getting back to the Gemara of Chesron base. So we say that there's a difference between benching and shooter. When it comes to benching, we say that Oval is included with Rashi learns of Bichas Azimun because he's chayiv in mitzvahs and therefore he's included. And Tosha says we're talking about the brachas that you make specifically in the Oval's house. The Oval, by benching the Oval is included. But by a shooter right now, we're saying it isn't. Says the Gemara, we make bichasanim shabrachas by 10. Bichasanim mina minyan, the part of the minyan birchas avelim asavivelim by 10. Ein avelim minyan. We're talking about birchas bracha avelim, and yet bracha b'shura miika. Well, who makes a bracha when you come to the shura? You don't make a bracha at all. Ella says the Gemara, ki am Rabbi Yechon b'rechava. When Rabbi Yechon says that an oval is not part of the minyan, he's talking out in the street. In the street, there used to be the very first meal that you get when an oval comes back from the levaya. The very first meal, sudas havra, is food that usually a bagel and egg. It's food that the oval does not use their own. People give it to them to share with them to make them feel better. So that's called sudas havra. And that sudas havra, we say, what do you call it? Rabbi Yechon says that the oval is not included in that minyan. Says the Gemara. It can't be that either, even though there's a bracha there, because you're washing everything else. It can't be that. Why not? He said, Chassan is part of 10. Kol Shiva 7 days. The Chassanim min haminyan. Birchas avelim ba'asara kol Shiva ve'ein avelim haminyan. Birchas avelim are not part of the minyan. They're not part of the minyan. They're not part of the minyan. But he says 7 days. Rechava is only the first day. You're right. The first time you come back to Levaya. Says the Gemara, no. First one, his question is, where do you find 7 days? He says, well, yes, we do. Just like we have, we'll soon see Bashar Baruch, the concept of a panim chadashes. In other words, a new face here, we mentioned yesterday. When it comes to panim chadashes, we would say that you make Shar Baruchas again. And we discussed yesterday different shittas, what the definition of panim chadashes is. We also had a machlekes whether Shabbos, Teisha says Shabbos is considered panim chadashes, but other Rishonim disagree. They just say that on Shabbos you have so many guests, surely definitely somebody there who wasn't at the Panach Hadashas. Big machlekes, I told you yesterday, whether when we say Panach Hadashas, it could have been by the chuppah, but they shouldn't have been by the wedding, or they could have been by the wedding, but they weren't by the chuppah. No, it is important to eat. This Panach Hadashas doesn't even have to be part of the meal. Is it the meal that makes it, or is it just the simcha itself, the atmosphere? We don't need the meal, so they don't have to eat at all to be part of the the minyan for Shar Brachas, and so on. And this big machlekes, Panach Hadashas can be a woman as well. Because does the Panach Hadashas have to be people who are able to respond to the Shor Brachos, who are able to make the Shor Brachos? That can only be done by men, or when it comes to Simcha, it doesn't matter. As long as there's an ear of Simcha, we can make it even though they themselves cannot make the bracha. The Ritva says that women not included, others say why not? Anyway, so the Gemara answers Chava and 7 days, because the Panach Hadashas every single day you have a Sudas Abra. Says Gemara, how do I know that? But Abba was the one who was a teacher of Chumash to Reish Lakish's kids. The Amla, others say, Master Reish Lakish, he taught Mishnayos Reish Lakish's kids. One day, the Abba's son, his youngest son, his Mazinka, passed away. So Yom Kama, the very first day, didn't go to him. The next day, so the second day of Avela is Dabre Yehuda Bar Nachmeni Meturgameni. So Reish Lakish slept along Yehuda Bar Nachmeni, who was his interpreter, his translator. And he said, come with me. I'm like, kum ein mamilsa. Come, let's go and make and say bracha. And we see they're going to say brachas there. And therefore we see that, and they were upon chadashes, they weren't there the first day. So we see clearly from here that upon chadashes, you say the brachas all over again. That's what we bring a proof. But then Gemara will say, kol kabel yenuka pasach bama. This is what he said. He says, responding to the idea that somebody never lost a young child. So he decided this is how to console him. So he opened up and he said, Reish Lakish said, say something nice. Anybody who loses a young child. So this is what the guy said. He stood up, and this is what he said. Hashem saw Vayinatz Mekas, and he got angry for his sons and daughters. So he translates as follows. He twists the pasuk around. That Hashem saw Vayinatz, he got angry Mekas, because he forced him to use up his anger to punish somebody's young kids. Because the parents sinned, he punished young kids. Hashem gets angry just for that alone, for forcing his hand. So therefore, the kids were innocent. A generation that antagonizes Hashem, and Hashem vents his anger against his children. That's what he said first, which doesn't sound like a big consolation, because basically saying it's your fault. We'll see in a minute. The others say, Bochrei wasn't a bezink, he wasn't a little tiny tot, because actually he was a teenager. He used another posting, the same idea. He said, I came Bachurov, Hashem. Hashem's not happy with Bachurov, as you say, and the orphans and the widows, he does have Rahmanas, Kikulai, Chonaf, who made out Kopeh, because they're all Chanifa, they're all false. And they use bad language. They speak grotesquely. The whole he's in this, and even afterwards, Hashem's anger doesn't return. Because they don't do tshuva, so therefore Hashem's hand is still outstretched, ready to punish more. For example, Hakol Yodim, everyone knows everyone knows why a Kala gets married. To live with a husband. But if somebody's grotesque, or mighty dove and a pillar with all of people, he decides to describe it literally what happens. And so it's speaking in Nivelpeh. Even if it was decreed for the next 70 years, which is a person's lifetime, to have a good life, the entire thing will turn into bad. So Reish Lakish turned to him, I don't understand. So you're saying here that it's all their fault because of the sins that they did. So he says, also you came, I asked you to console them, and instead you're telling the parents it's all your fault, you sinned, you have nivel peh. So he said to the Turkmen, said to Shlaka, you misunderstood me. That's what I'm telling you. That the parents were tzaddikim. But because there are people in the generation who misbehave, but Hashem always punishes the tzaddikim for what's happening in the generation. So I want to say to the parents, you guys are so, first of all, the kids are innocent. You guys are so choshev in the eyes of Hashem, and therefore your children are taken away. But it's a positive thing. Choshev atlet fusi adora, that you are choshev enough, that Yibshah will penalize you for the behavior of the generation. Amalei, so then he said to him, go ahead and praise the Eibush himself. Pasach v'amar, he started to say, and these are the brachas, these are called brachas of Elam, because each one starts with Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu L'Olam. He says, Baruch Hashem Elokeinu L'Olam, but Adi v'chazak is so strong, but Rev Norois Mechayim Meis, it's awesome how you Mechayim Meis with your words. Isaac does Adi Cheker on the believer, and he flies Adi Mispah Baruch Atah Hashem Mechayim Meis. Amalei said, fine, that's bracha number 1. Now it's bracha number 2. The Shlaka said to Maturgiman, Kum Eima Milsa Keneged Avelim. So it sounds like this Maturgiman is the one who composed these brachas. He said to him, go say something for the Avelim, towards the Avelim. You know, comfort them. He said to them, my brethren who are suffering and enduring this terrible avelis, you should think for a minute, investigate this. This is what stands always. This is the ways of the world from the beginning of creation. People are born and people die. Rabim Shasu, Rabim Yishtu. People drank a long time ago, they're no longer with us. People will drink and they no longer will be with us either. The people in the future are just like the people in the past. And that's the way of the world. You know, the circle of life, that's the way of the world. People are born, people pass away. So, of course, it's a terrible tragedy, but it's not the end of the world. This is the Eibish's plan. That the Achenu, our brethren, Baal Nechamas, the Eibish, the ultimate consoler, will console you. Baruch Menachem Avelu. That's the next bracha. Abai disagrees with the bracha. He says one thing is to talk about the past. Why invite the future, say that everybody's going to die? What a morbid statement to make, and more. Okay, say talk about the past. People drank and they're no longer here. Why invite also that the future people are going to continue dying? Don't say that. Talk about the first one. Because the Rosh says a very important thing. Never say anything to invite the Satan to say, you yourself believe that that person deserves to be punished, or you yourself believe that this should happen. Don't ever say anything which gives a door to the Satan to take advantage of and say, well, you said it, so why shouldn't it happen? How do you know? Because it says in the pasuk, Shai was lecturing the Eden, and he says, "You Eden said, you said we were like Zdaim, la'amayda dominu were compared to amayda. You just said we're compared to, right? You didn't say you are. Maya Hadalei, what did the Navi then reprimand them with? He said, Shimud var Hashem continues Zdaim. Listen to me, listen to Abish's words, you officers of Zdaim. He called the Eden Zdaim because they already opened that door by saying we're like Zdaim. Same thing here. You have to be very careful when you utter something to say, a terrible thing's going to happen. I believe this probably is going to happen. Because then all you're doing is inviting the Satan. Tiftach Pel Satan. Amalei Shlaka turned to him and said, fine. Say something against towards those the people who came to console the Avel. Pasavamri said, you brethren who are so charitable, the children of charitable, so in the genes. That you go ahead and you maintain the bris of Avram. Who was Avram? Avram was the ultimate Goimel Chesed. He did, as Rashi says, he planted an Eishel. Eishel, Rashi says, an abbreviation, Achila, Shtia, Levia, escort. Others say Lina, sleeping. And Sheneva said, I know because he passed it on to his children. Achenu Balei Agmul, Yishalachem Gulchem, Achenu, my brethren. Balei Agmul, the one who's the ultimate generous being, should pay you for your generosity. Baruch atah Hashem, Shalom Agmul. That's the third bracha. Amalei said, Kum Ema Milsa Keneged Koyi. So now say something to all the Jews, not the Avelim, not the mourners, and not the people who came to Menachem, then but the Klal Yisrael. This is the fourth bracha. Paschav Amar Ribono Olamim. Pedeva Hatzel Melat Hoisha Amcha Yisrael, help us out. Min Hadover, Ma'adever, Min Hacheder, Min Abiza, Min Hashadafim, Min Harokin. Save us from all the terrible tragedies, including the epidemics, pandemics, and then from war, and then so on, and plundering and drought. Any kind of suffering that the world endures. Before we dive into you, you already respond to us. Hashem, one holds back the Magefa. Okay, these are the four brachas. We say Birchas Avelim, this is it. Amarula says Ula. Va'amila b'mastir tolit nebraisa. Asara kaises tiknu chachamim bebeisa avam. The only reason why Hashem created wine is, it says it so that you should. So the pasuk says, "Tenu sheicha la'ayvid." Give beer, give old wine to somebody who suffers, who was in a state of mourning. So it says, how much do you drink? You should drink 10 cups of wine. 10 cups of wine one should drink. 3 before eating to open up as an appetizer. 3 during the meal to make, to wash down your food. Let the food soak in your intestines. And another 4 when you finish eating, drink another 4 cups of wine, because the 4 brachas are benching. Then the people used to add more. Then the Avelim drank another 4 cups. I mean, just picture this: 14 glasses of wine. And what do they do that for? One is for the Chevra Kadisha, the people there who actually help out the people in the city. So you drink a cup for them. And then one for the people who are generous. And they, Rashi says, these are the rich people who gave money to be able to bury all the poor who couldn't afford to be buried. And the Echad Keneged Beis Hamikdash, always have to remember the Beis Hamikdash, and it's always, especially when we're doing the Chumim. The Echad Keneged Gamliel, and one for Gamliel, as soon as Gemara, why Gamliel got a special mention. What happened was his Chilu Hayishais in the Mishtaki. They were getting drunk. They brought it back from 14 down to 10. That's amazing. Rashi holds they brought it back to 10, as if to say that if you drink 10 cups of wine, you don't get shikar. I don't know, but that's what Rashi seemed in those days. They didn't get so shikar. 10 cups of wine today would definitely. How many allowed to drink before you can you considered drunk? You can't drive. But the Rit for other Rishonim say Liyoshna means forget the whole thing. You only drink 4 cups of wine or whatever it is, and that's it. The whole meaning was abolished because even 10 cups is way too much. So the average machlekes Rashi and the Ritva if 10 cups was too much or not. Why am I going to mention what happened was that the expenses to bury someone was far too great, and it was more an ordeal for the family, the mourners, than the actual death, because they had to pay for it. They didn't have any money to pay for it. So what they used to do was, if you remember anywhere in Cotton, they would bring the dead body near a base of cars, and they would all run away. They would flee because they didn't have the money. They didn't want anyone to come chasing after them to pay for the burial, so they would all flee. Who's a Nasi, and was a very wealthy man, came along, the Noyig Kalas Ba'atzmeh. Because what happened was, because it was on the public, they made sure they dressed in the finest, and they couldn't afford it. So they were embarrassed. So they just ran away, fled. Rabbi Gamliel, who was very wealthy, he decided that he is going to treat himself as if he's very poor. So he made sure that they just put linen on a sheet of linen on him, or made out of linen, nothing fancy, no ornaments, nothing. The Nagu Kolam Achrav, and as a result of that, the meaning became for everybody, regardless of your financial status. Everyone dressed the same way. They will go out with these clothes of linen, and therefore it's a big, kudos to Rabbi Gamliel for bringing that in, so nobody was embarrassed, and they buried all the dead with dignity rather than running away and being ashamed. Even made out of other materials which are even cheaper than linen, nobody cares anymore, because the common denominator is we just use something very, very cheap and we move on. So that's why they drank a cup in honor of Rabbi Gamliel, who made life so much easier and respectable for everybody. Okay, back to the Gemara. Rabbi Elazar said, remember, girls used to get married very young. So there were two things. There's the hymen. So if let's say she's not a virgin anymore, the hymen will be torn open. That's called Pesach Basuach Matzasi. And I found an opening. In fact, I remember when in the years ago when they had the computer searches looking for, if you want to look for topics, you put in a search. And so if you put in mezuzah, this Gemara would come up, Pesach Basuach Matzasi, because mezuzah you always put on the door. And the computer, I guess, couldn't understand the context, and therefore it came up. Anyway, so you have two things, the two signs, two vital signs. One is she's bleeding, which shows that never had relations before, and the other one is if Pesach Pasuach Matzasi, there's no hymen. So what happens if the man, Rabbi Elazar says, he says two things. He's teaching us two dinim here. First of all, Ha'omed Pesach Pasuach Matzasi. He doesn't talk about the blood at all. Obviously, there was no blood there, but that's not the issue. The issue is that Pesach Pasuach Matzasi. I found that it was an opening, so therefore maybe she had relations while we were engaged. Remember, they were engaged for a long time. Now, how is it possible there was no blood there? The Rashi says because there were certain families that just the girls never had blood at all, called the family of Durkati. But there's also Taisa says, not Rashi, by a Boigeris, and there's a big a girl over 12 years old, a girl over 12 years old. Rabbeinu Chananel says that there is what do you call it? There's no or Rabbeinu Tam versions. There's no over 12 years old. There's no blood anymore, but it's still the hymen is still there. Rashi holds all the way around. By Begeris, it's all the way around. There's still blood, but the hymen is no longer there. But regardless, the only problem was Pesach Pasuach Matzasi. So that's one thing. That the question is that a claim to say that there's something suspect there? That's number one. And number two is. Now this is a she contradicts it. She says it's not true, and because or she's quiet, says nothing. Therefore, the chiddush here is that even though we have absolutely no proof or anything else, the fact that he came along with this claim, what he's basically saying is, I cannot live with her anymore because this has happened. So therefore, the concept of shavya and nafshe chatiche deser. If a person comes along and says, I know this is us, even though he has no evidence whatsoever, as far as he's concerned, for example, we're going to see, if a man says, I got engaged to her in front of witnesses, and she says, we never got engaged. The rule is, she's not bound to him at all, and she can marry this guy's brother. But he cannot marry her sister anymore, because as far as he's concerned, he came up and said that I married her. So a person is believed. Now the question is whether the Kesuvos Daf talks about his length. Is it because we believe him, or is it because like a neder? Coming up with the story, we don't know if it happened or not, but it's as if you made a vow, and when you make a vow, you have to follow it. And therefore, if he made a vow that I married this woman, as far as you're concerned, you're married to her, so therefore you're not allowed to live with her sisters, with her mother, or anything else. As far as she's concerned, she's not bound by your vow, so therefore no problem. Or is it we actually believe him as far as he's concerned? It's a question of belief or a neder. But either way, it's called shavya nafshe chatiche deser. We learned it from Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Elazar comes along and says, if someone says Pesach Matzasi, I found that the hymen wasn't there, but there was no blood. He's believed to aser on himself. Interesting, it says, it doesn't say al atzman himself, it says Allah. That means the bezin now will enforce it. You came to a bezin that told us the story that we are not going to let you remain married to her anymore at all, even though we can't prove one way or another. But you cannot take away your ksuba, because as far as we're concerned, we don't know if it ever happened or not. So she gets a ksuba and tires the ksuba, and you have to divorce her. Now the question is, Amai, svek sveiku, isn't this a double suffix here? First of all, suffix tachta, suffix ain't tachta. First of all, how do you know when it happened? Maybe it happened before they got engaged. So therefore, if it happened before he got engaged, there's no Issa. Maybe it happened after he got engaged. And even after he got engaged, it still depends. If it was done by coercion, then she's permitted to live with the guy. Or did she do it voluntarily? So it's a svek sveka. We have a rule. Suffix, you're always machmer. But if it's a svek sveka, double suffix, it becomes like a majority, the way the Rashba learns. I mean, there's 4 different ways of learning. But the Rashba learns becomes like a majority. And therefore, it becomes like a majority. Therefore, you follow majority probability that she's mutter to you. So why is it Asa? And the Rivash learned the reason why svek svek is mutter is there's only vada iser and suffix iser. There's no third category. The third category is mutter. The moment you take it out of suffix iser, the next category is mutter. That's why it's mutter. Anyway, says the Gemara, even if it happened while they were engaged, something but something but as Gemara, you're right. You know when we take, you know when Abelazar says it's din, he's limiting it to H's kohen, the wife of a kohen. There's only one suffix, because if it happened while they were engaged, we don't care if it was done, by coercion or done voluntarily. She's always us with her husband. One suffix, therefore, Abelazar says, not live with her anymore. Or Yibayseim, another answer is Be'eshes Yisrael. We're talking about a Yiddish woman, but you're going to Kabul she got engaged before she was 3 years old, and we say that if she had any relations before 3, the psulim, the hymen will grow back. And now she's over 12. The hymen would have grown back a long time ago. So therefore, and the blood would have come back to her body. So therefore, we say there's only one suffix. It definitely did not happen before 3 years old. She was already engaged after 3. There's only one suffix, voluntarily or not voluntarily. Now, true, under 12 years old, you should do a child rape, even if it's voluntary, it's considered child rape. Like the whole world does. But over 12, there's a suffix, oinus or rotzen. And even though it's a small likelihood because it's a small window compared to the rest of the time, but nevertheless, shem ein is chadut, so it's 50-50. And Toys already says that the roiv, that rotzen actually is probably more than einus, because einus people will hear about it. People that would talk about it, not like today, it was quiet. People would have talked about it because it's a terrible thing, and we want to stop the person doing it again. Or there'll be all kinds of rumors abounding. So the chance of being binus is slim. The chances of barotzen is far greater, but it's not a strong roiv. It is only a roiv de rabbanon, and contrary to that, she has a chazaka. And the chazaka says she was permitted to her husband and got engaged. She's probably permitted to her husband right now as well. So you have a chazaka and a minority chance against a roiv, and therefore we say that what do you call it? That it's awesome because the roiv has been weakened. So Moshe Mike the whole chiddush is that what? That what do you call it? Tays already asked another question, by the way. There's another possibility. Mukas eights. She was doing aerobics, or a piece of wood fell inside, or doing the horseback riding, which basically tore the hymen and all that. Why don't we just say attribute to that? So Tays says, because if it'd be that, she would actually say that. She would say, "Oh, I went horseback riding all this time." There's nothing embarrassing about it. She should have said it. Because Tays holds that it's quite common. Mukas eights. So say something. The fact that she didn't say anything means that she's all right. What happens if she actually said, "Yes, I did have relations, but I was coerced"? Most of Shainim hold, the big machlekes, that you believe her because then she becomes a bari and he's a shema. Does he know it didn't happen? No, it's only maybe. She has a bari. She says definitely, I'm still permitted to you. So she has a bari together with a chazaka. The chazaka says when he got engaged, I was allowed to live with you. Probably I'm still allowed to live with you. So the chazaka, which is the status quo, combined with the fact that she is definitive, bari. This is what happened. Bari v'shema, bari adav. Says Gemara, Mike Mashal cook to go. What's a chiddush that a person can ask it? We learned already. A person says to a woman, we got married. He met like never got married. He says with witnesses, he met and we can't find them. He muted as b'krei, as far as she's concerned, never happened. She's permitted to marry all of his relatives. He is forbidden with her relatives because he came along. He said that I was married. So what do you need to tell you about what's Abelazar's chiddush? No. I would have thought Hassam did the Vada Kimla. He knows if he got married or not, and he claims he did. So as far as he's concerned, in his world, he's married to her, so all the prohibitions come into place. Over here, make him hudulay kimle. You think he knows 100% that there was no Pesach there? He thinks he knows. He's a bacher. He never married either. You think he suddenly became an expert? Even though it's difficult to understand, a few days ago we learned that Roi Bikine, most people know how to get around it. How do they know? There's a bacher never had relations before. Anyway, so maybe we would have thought that he just thinks it happened. So maybe we'll say to him, look, she denies it. You think it happened, probably never happened. That it probably was a Pesach, he didn't even realize it. Kamashla, no, he maintains that there was no Pesach, he has to behave that way. Okay, we'll stop over here and continue tomorrow.